Wow, good afternoon. What a crowd. I'm Christine Wade, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies, and I'm also the curator of the Goldstein Program in Public Affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth and final installment of our series, Anatomy of an Election. I know that many of you, because I've seen your faces here throughout this entire series, have been such devout followers of the series. And on behalf of myself and Adam Goodhart, CV Star Center, I'd just like to thank you for coming out and supporting the series. For those of you who are a little sad, by the way, that this is the end of the series and you're wondering how you're going to fill your time, I have good news for you, because tomorrow night, the CV Star Center is debuting a new series, Meet the Founders, featuring eminent historian of the Revolutionary Era, Richard Beeman, who perhaps some of you remember from his terrific series in the spring, who's going to be painting vivid portraits of men who played prominent roles in creating the American nation. It says the first talk begins tomorrow at 5:30 in the Decker Theater, and there are handouts available at the door, and I believe at the CV Star Center's marketing station, which I've come to envy, going to be here. I'd also like to thank my co-sponsors, the CV Star Center, particularly Adam Goodhart and his staff, Michael Buckley, and others who have been so instrumental in putting this all together. And thank you to Eric Broussard, who has dutifully recorded all of these events for us. So I don't know if you have access to the news, but earlier this afternoon, a tanker turned over on the Bay Bridge. Ah, yes. And behind it were our speakers. They have been released from captivity, and we hear they are slowly making their way up the eastern shore. And so I'll explain the format in a moment, but we're basically going to buy ourselves a little bit of time, allow you to get yourselves familiar with one of our speakers for today, Jack Bohr. And hopefully they will arrive lest Adam and I have to charm you for 45 minutes or so. Right? And Adam will do much better than I will. The subject of today's talk was the media and its role in campaigns. And whatever you think about the state of the media today, there's little doubt that the media plays a critically important role in campaigns. It can shape the agenda, influence public opinion and outcomes, and even influence the selection of candidates. And in the new media age, all of this information is being transmitted to potential voters more rapidly than it was even a decade ago. I'm going to proceed with the introduction of our speakers so that when they do arrive, I won't have to interrupt any more than necessary the flow. This was originally a four-person panel down to three, and now we have Jack. But you'll come to realize soon how incredibly special this is. Our two missing speakers, right? Betsy Fisher Martin has been with Meet the Press, NBC's top-rated Sunday morning program and the longest-running television program in the world, for 21 years, and she served as executive producer for the last decade. She has covered the network's coverage of the 1992, 96, 2000, 2004, 8, and 12 elections, and received numerous awards, including 2 Emmys, the Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Political Journalism. Jonathan Martin is a correspondent for the online journal Politico, where he's covered the 2008 and 2012 elections. In the past 6 years, he's been to 30 states covering elections, and he previously covered politics for the National Review and the Hotline. Our third guest, our former moderator, now feature speaker for this event, is Washington College alumni Jack Bohr. You might know him by his nom de plume, right? John Bohr, right? He graduated from Washington College in 2006 with a major in political science. Since then, he has written about politics for the New Republic, Politico, Salon, and a number of other publications, and is in the process of completing a book on Robert F. Kennedy in the 1960s for Bloomsbury Press. He is a writer-in-residence at the Frederick Lewis Allen Room in the New York Public Library, and a past recipient of the Sorensen Fellowship at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. Just this week, does anyone know what BuzzFeed is? See, I'm slightly ahead of the curve, right? His piece, Making Mitt, The Myth of George Romney, was picked up by a variety of media outlets, including Politico, Huffington Post, The Washington Post, Daily Mail, I could go on. And he was proclaimed, he loves this, highbrow brilliant. Highbrow brilliant. He's a Washington College grad, right? Well, highbrow brilliant by New York Magazine. All right, he's going to get a tattoo, right? So please join me in welcoming, for the moment, my co-host Adam Goodhart, Jack Bohr, right? Mr. Highbrow Brilliant, and we're going to try to guide a discussion with Jack about his work in the media, and we're hoping that Jonathan and Betsy will be arriving probably within the next 10 minutes. That's our hope.
Well, yeah,
Sure.
we hope. Yeah, they were, I think they were released from their Bay Bridge captivity about 40 minutes ago, so we hope that they'll be here soon, unless something else overturned on Route 213, like, I don't know, possibly a cow or something like that. What is there?
Farm equipment.
Yeah, a tractor.
Yeah.
Tractors are kind of hard to overturn.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm really, really glad that Jack Bohr is here. I'll say this before our other two speakers get here, that you're really getting the best of the panel right here. Jack, am I echoing terribly here? Am I echoing less now? Okay. Jack was, as Christine said, a graduate of Washington College in 2006. He was a political science major, and he also was an associate at the Starr Center. I think you were our first student associate, actually, Jack. Yeah, and as a student associate, we have certain outstanding students, usually juniors and seniors, to whom we actually give office space up on the third floor of the Custom House, sort of under the eaves of the building. And while Jack was a student associate, he actually started working. He was working on his thesis, which was about Robert Kennedy and the cadre of young aides who surrounded him in the 1960s. And I remember Jack would be sort of sleeping up on the top floor of the Custom House while he was writing his thesis. And that project is actually what's grown into the work that he's doing now, that's now a book project under contract with Bloomsbury Press. Those of you who are big Harry Potter readers may note that Bloomsbury is the publisher of Harry Potter. So we expect Jack's book to outsell Harry Potter when it is published.
And I've never seen J.K. Rowling in the highbrow brilliant category.
No, that's right. She's definitely not. So anyway, I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk about Jack's work. So maybe he can tell us a little bit about his RFK work, but I'd also actually like to start out by asking him about the project that was dubbed Highbrow Brilliant by New York Magazine, which was a 10,000 word investigation of George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, and looking into the sort of the legend of George Romney and the reality of George Romney. It's a fascinating piece, and Jack, maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. There was maybe a widespread belief about Mitt Romney, that he was forged in his father's 1968 presidential campaign. His father, who famously lost it by saying he just had the greatest brainwashing by the generals and diplomats when he went over to Vietnam. It really cost him the election. His father was known as a man who was very principled and very forthright and plain-spoken, evidenced by his walking out of the 1964 Republican National Convention in protest over Barry Goldwater and civil rights. This is a story that was repeated widely. It was in the Washington Post. It was in the New York Times. In the Frontline documentary, some of you might have saw a few weeks ago, The Choice 2012, they mentioned Mitt saw his father storm out of the convention when Barry Goldwater was nominated. Except that story wasn't true. That story was a creation of later years. I discovered the true story of George Romney in reading about Robert Kennedy and 1960s politics. The two didn't really make sense. The one who was represented by his colleagues and by the reporters who covered him, and the guy we hear about from reporters and others now. To go back, the 1964 Republican National Convention took place over 3 days, and the myth was sort of that he walked out when the civil rights plank was defeated, he walked out when Barry Goldwater was nominated, he walked out when Barry Goldwater said extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. And those are three different occurrences, so I kind of was looking for when was the walkout. It wasn't there. And so what I did was I just looked at George Romney's record in 1962 and 1964 when he campaigned. And also, notably, when Mitt Romney was around. Mitt Romney was in France from 1966 until 1968. He wasn't even around for his father's campaign. From what I've read and from what he said, it seems to me he doesn't even really quite understand what happened, what went wrong in that campaign. But he was around when his father was a winner in 1962 and 1964. And what I discovered in researching George Romney's campaigns in 1962 and 1964 were that he distanced himself from other Republicans, not just conservative Republicans, but also moderate Republicans. In 1964, he separated himself from Bill Scranton, Nelson Rockefeller, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., people you might remember. He forged his own platform amendments. Those were defeated. And then when Goldwater was nominated and gave his convention speech, George Romney was upset. And Ken Keating, a senator from New York, walked out, but George Romney didn't walk out. He was disappointed and expressed his disappointment to reporters, and he began looking into how he was going to go forward in 1964. So it wasn't this principled action all at once. He did some work with Goldwater. He met with him. He actually even drafted a speech for him in which he would declare extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, but. And then that but was in which he declared extremism and a vice in certain cases, which is not to defend Barry Goldwater, but it is to say that it wasn't so clear cut. And I also, going into his papers in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, I discovered a poll from late August 1964 in which they polled the quote unquote all-white race-conscious Michigan communities of Dearborn at the time and a place called Hamtramck. I can't quite pronounce that correctly. It's Polish. And they looked to suss out a white backlash vote. Now, the poll came back saying that the Republican label was more unpopular than LBJ's civil rights bill. But at the same time, the idea is just that it wasn't a all-at-once principled decision. He was somewhat calculating. He was somewhat opportunistic. Later in that 1964 election, he distanced himself from moderate Republicans like Ellie Peterson, who was so stung by his actions and his words on October 17, 1964, that she recounted years later of how mad the newsmen who were with her were because they all knew how hard she had been working. And so that's kind of the story of George Romney, is not as quite as simple and it's one-dimensional. He was a great man of principle on civil rights and on certain issues, but he wasn't this man who operated in a political outside of politics completely. And I think that's something that Mitt Romney is judged too harshly on, and I think it's revealing on Mitt Romney's character, on how he became who he is. And so that's what that story was, and that's why it made a big stir. So.
Jack, have you had any response from the Romney camp to your piece?
No, we contacted them asking them, well, here's the thing. I'll explain to you how the myth got started. George Romney was an interesting guy. From the books that were published about him in the 1960s, they tell little stories about how he exaggerated when he was a little kid. I discovered that George Romney exaggerated a little bit about whether he marched with Martin Luther King Jr. or not. In a 1988 interview, he told he said that I marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Detroit down Woodward Avenue. He actually did not, but he remembered it that way. So in 1994, the first appearance of the walkout myth happens when Mitt Romney tells, not Jonathan, when Mitt Romney tells Bay Windows Magazine, asked a question about same-sex couples and their rights, saying, my father walked out of the 1964 Republican National Convention. That's the first instance I found of it. That's
when he says that he's going to outdo Ted Kennedy on gay rights, right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
And he later
out-gay Ted Kennedy.
Yeah. And later in 2005, it appeared in a Boston Globe column or a Boston Globe article by Nina Easton And then it appeared later in 2006 in the Atlantic magazine. So right there you have the Boston Globe and you have the Atlantic printing that. This was when Mitt Romney was a little bit more liberal and before he started running for president. And then when he became more conservative, he still told that story. He told that story in 2007 on Meet the Press. But the story sort of turned on him, whereas people in the media, and especially sort of liberal opinion people, harped on it, calling Mitt Romney less principled and sort of an insult to his father. So the story that Mitt Romney had a hand in creating, and I don't know how Mitt Romney got the story. His father might have told him that that's what happened. Mitt Romney was there, by the way. He was 17 years old. It sort of turned on him and became something that he was attacked with more than he touted. So there you have that story, and it's really fascinating of just how no one checked it for so long.
Well, Jack, you're an impressive historian. You're an impressive sort of archives hound. You get in there. You
Which
take
I
the.
learned from you.
No, you really take the stories that people are repeating over and over again, the conventional wisdom, and you really fact check them. But you're also operating in interesting ways in the current political milieu. You were a blogger back when people used to blog. Now do you say a Twitterer or a tweeter?
Well, you say tweeter, but you don't really say that at all.
Okay, well, you are
I'm on Twitter.
an active denizen of Twitter, very active. In fact, you've actually been tweeting some of these events from the audience. So, having this perspective both on the political climate and political milieu of 50 years ago and that of today, just how much has the media role in campaigns changed? It's
hard to say. It moves very fast now, and that news cycles are no longer 24-hour news cycles. They're almost not even 6 hours news cycle. This guy, Dylan Byers, who is a media reporter for Politico, once did a story about the 21-minute news cycle. And because of Twitter, a news event will happen. It won't be very big, but it'll be a news event. And so for the first maybe 3 or 4 minutes, people are tweeting, breaking, this happened. Then the next 4 or 5 minutes are a little bit of analysis of this means this for this race. And then within about 10 to 15 minutes of an event breaking begins the joke cycle of people just cracking wry jokes. And if you follow Twitter, you get this sort of sense. And so you can check Twitter, and if you check it when it's in the joke cycle, you're kind of wondering, why is everybody talking about bayonets? Or that's today. Or why is everyone talking about binders of women? Or something. Or what have you. And so that's how fast it moves. So the impact that it's had on I think people in general, I think still consume their news maybe on a once-a-day basis, unless it's very, very big news. So I still think that there's a smallness to every event now, I think, the people who are in the media, which I think translates, if an important piece of news breaks in the morning, you're lucky if you're going to get a news story on it on the front page of the New York Times and not an analysis story on it, I think. I read a lot of old news, and for example, just yesterday I was reading the old New York Post, back when it was a liberal newspaper in the 1960s. And they make listicles. I'm reading it in December 1963, and for real, they were running a series of 10 greatest assassinations in history. So, so media, it changes, it stays the same, but I would say it just moves so fast. And
Yeah, I want to ask a question about Latin America, but it doesn't seem relevant. That's what happens when your expertise isn't the topic. No, but Adam had asked you a question earlier about the reaction that you got to the Romney piece. And you were saying, we hosted a tea and talk for Jack earlier down at the Alumni House, and Jack was saying that he'd gotten actually some really angry reactions from people about the post.
Yeah, there are the generic angry people who, it was an 11,000 word piece, and within a minute of it going up, I got you're despicable or something, some messages on that. But on this story, it's interesting because I got it from both liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans. Republicans who were thinking I was trying to attack Mitt Romney's father, when really I was just trying to report an untold story. Democrats who thought I was trying to boost up I was trying to denigrate George Romney to make Mitt Romney look better. I had another historian accuse me of being an apologist for Mitt. It was a good story in the sense that a lot of people hated it.
When you're getting flack from both sides.
It means you've done something right.
So
Yeah.
it tweaked the people who are easily tweaked on all sides, so that's good. But a lot of people really did enjoy it and really thought it was something different. I mean, I called up the guy who in New York Magazine said, and together they marched out of the Republican National Convention and began the 1968 campaign. I called that guy saying, tell me about the 1964 convention, and he says, I hear that story all the time. I don't know where it comes from. It's not me, and I thought he was one of the sources of it, actually. And I was floored, and you can tell the editor of BuzzFeed, a guy named Ben Smith, who some of you may know from cable television and from formerly of Politico, he wrote a piece about how it's so easy to believe the stories that are told from people who are in the room, supposedly. In the New Yorker's profile of Mitt Romney, written by the dean of the Columbia Journalism School, there is an inaccuracy that would have been easily caught of, I think, possibly a misremembering on Mitt Romney's behalf of a 1964 moment with his father. That could have been checked by looking at the biographies of George Romney and calling the guy, Mitt Romney quotes the pollster for George Romney. They could have called the pollster. He lives in North Carolina. His phone number is publicly listed. And he told me the story was not true. So when you write a story like that, though, that makes people feel like they miss something, it gets them upset as well.
But it's an interesting story, isn't it, really? Because I think it says a lot about the continuing trend in the media that if you hear a story propagated enough, that it must be true, that there's truth to it. And there's a symbiosis between the media and politicians in doing this, right? Selling the myth of whatever. Please be them. Oh, yay!
Good to see you.
How are you?
Good to see
you.
Hey, welcome. Good to see you.
Hey, Jack.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Thanks for having me. So welcome, Betsy Fisher Martin and Jonathan Martin from Meet the Press and Politico. And I guess actually, well, you were introduced earlier, but I wanted to ask you. Yeah.
And you guys have been doing what we call the TV business vamping.
Yes. I want to actually ask you sort of about your personal journey to where you got to, not necessarily what jobs you went through, but just the people who helped you along the way, and how did you get to be doing the kind of job you're doing now? So I guess, Betsy, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Well, I started somewhat by accident, actually. I studied politics in college at American University and was planning to go to law school, and decided to do a couple different internships throughout my time there. I was on the Hill at a law firm, and then I decided to do an internship at Meet the Press. It was right down the street, our Washington bureau from where I went to school. I figured, this will be great. I can sleep late, walk to my internship. What else can a college student want? So I did that and met at the same time Tim Russert, who had just started as the moderator of Meet the Press, and that was sort of it
This
for
is about
me.
1994?
This was 92.
92.
Yeah, I graduated from college in 92.
She doesn't look that old.
Of course not.
And really sort of got bitten by the journalism bug at that point with him and made a career change. And Tulane University kept my law school deposit, and I sort of changed career paths.
John?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for your patience and for stalling here for a bit. I'm sure you heard by now that we had quite the experience at the Bay Bridge. So it's good to be here, and we're thrilled to talk to y'all. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, and so I'm a son of the Beltway. I always joke if I ever ran for office, I would tout my proud Beltway values. I don't think it'll work that well. So I grew up in an area where obviously politics is the company town, and I was lucky to have parents who were passionate about politics and history. And they dragged my brother and I to every conceivable battlefield, museum, anywhere where George Washington slept, ate, his horse got water, you name it, we visited it. And that was the story of my childhood. And you know, there are two ways that you can respond to that. You can run from that and you can become an insurance adjuster, or you can embrace it. And that's what I did. And I knew I wanted to pursue something to do with public affairs and history and government politics. That was my passion. I was terrible at math, so it wasn't really a tough choice when it came to science. But that was always the path that I wanted to be on, and studied history in college, politics a little bit in college too. I worked in politics after college, largely because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, and that seemed like a sort of fun thing to do for a few years. But loved writing and reading, and was sort of led on a natural path to being in journalism. I got a lucky break. I was working on Capitol Hill. I'd done a couple of campaigns, and I was just dying to start covering politics and writing about politics. And I didn't know how in the heck, at the age of 25 or 26, it was possible to make that transition. And I just talked to a bunch of folks, cold calls, cold emails really, and I lucked out. And a guy named Chuck Todd, who you now may have heard of, was then the editor-in-chief of The Hotline, which was then and is now a publication that's put out every day, sort of compiling that day's political news. And Chuck said, I'll give you a chance. I can't pay you much, but you can come over here and learn political journalism from the bottom up. And so long story short, that's what I did, and then had a chance to go to Politico, and that was the end of '06 when Politico launched, start of '07. And so that's where I've been ever since.
Right, and
thanks to John
you're
Harris.
everywhere because of Politico. So you were in Boca yesterday.
Yeah, in fact, I flew up this morning. I was in Boca last night for the debate and took the first flight this morning out of there. Yeah.
And you wrote this. And we're really happy to have you. You wrote a story about the 7 states that matter yesterday. Can you give us real quick a state of the race?
Spoiler alert: Maryland's not one of them. That shouldn't stop you though from reading the piece on Politico.com. It's still available. Free of charge. It's there tonight when you go home. The 7 states that matter to me, and to the campaigns more importantly, are Colorado, Iowa, Wisconsin, Virginia, Florida, New Hampshire, and I am missing Ohio.
Sure. Whatever.
Ohio is, and Ohio, I'm saving the best for last, is central. I mean, I really think that the Obama campaign recognizes that North Carolina is moving away from them. The president hasn't been there since he was nominated in Charlotte. That tells you everything you have to know. I think the Romney campaign, even though they're going to Nevada today, in fact he's in Nevada now, I think they recognize that Nevada is probably leaning towards President Obama. So if you knock off those 2 states, you're left with the 7 that I just mentioned. And I think that Governor Romney is doing better in Florida, doing better in Virginia, and I really think that this is coming down to a Big Ten finale. Iowa, Wisconsin, and Ohio. I mean, I think that's going to tell us who the next president is. The Obama campaign is convinced they're still winning in Ohio. The Romney campaign is convinced that it's a dead heat there. I think we'll probably have a good sense on election night pretty early on what's happening when the polls close in Ohio.
So it's another swing state year.
It seems like that.
As is every year.
I mean, it does seem that way. I think Governor Romney's had an upward trajectory since the Denver debate. But if you look at the polling in Ohio, it's pretty stubborn. I mean, he's made progress. There's no question about it. But it's still a tough state for him.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like we're going to see a sort of major landslide
Okay.
on either side.
Betsy, wanted you to actually, we want to make this a little bit about the function of journalism. So when by the function, I mean what you actually go through. Can you take us through a week of making Meet the Press?
Sure. It's a little of an unscientific process, and it's a lot of juggling several balls at one time. Week to week, we're trying to present on Sunday not only of kind of the highlights of what just happened in a week, but we're trying to take a story and move it forward. We don't just want to be a rehash kind of show. So trying to do that and plan accordingly with 5 other competitors also going after the same pool of guests, you have to be able to sort of juggle what's important, what's going to happen, and putting all that together. Sort of what's happening in the beginning of the week sometimes does turn out to be what's interesting on Sunday. Other times we have to change course. I never like to ever have to cancel a guest. So you have to be really sure on a Wednesday or a Thursday, sometimes a Friday, when we do our final lineup, that what we have makes sense. But obviously, if there's some sort of breaking news situation, then we scrub the show and start over, because it's live on Sunday mornings at 9. The morning Saddam Hussein was captured was a Sunday morning at 6 a.m. So we started the show over, scrapped and rebooked guests, called senators on the phone, can you make your way to Nebraska Avenue? So, we have to juggle all that week to week, but when we're putting together the show, we try to think of the newsmakers that you want to hear from, and then we try to put together a roundtable of analysts, journalists, strategists to have a good, thoughtful discussion and a civil discussion. We don't want to be a version of Crossfire with a lot of screaming going on, but we do want to have an intelligent conversation every week. So if we do that correctly, that's obviously our goal.
And that every week thing, we were having a conversation earlier about how quickly the media moves today.
Yeah.
And, there are things that are changing. Saturday Night Live is sometimes on Thursday.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
has Meet the Press ever considered doing, when a big news story happens, something like on a Wednesday or something some other time? Or could you ever see that happening where Meet the Press isn't just Sunday?
Well, I don't know if we would package it as Meet the Press. I mean, David Gregory can certainly do and contribute across the NBC platforms to, some of the primetime television shows that already exist on NBC, like a Dateline or a Rock Center, and we have done things like that. We have a midweek show we call Press Pass, where we kind of do something interesting in the middle of the week. But you're right, it does change very quickly. But we try to adjust. But I mean, just Twitter. It used to be when I first started 20 years ago that on a Monday or Tuesday we'd have a pretty good sense of what made sense to do that next Sunday. That has gotten more difficult as we're in this 24/7 news cycle. That what is going on a Monday, chances are no one is really going to care about it by the next Sunday.
Jonathan, tell us about life on the trail. Maybe give us a look into it that we don't know about. You've traveled in 2008
Yep.
with a lot of Republican presidential
Yep.
candidates.
Traveled with the president overseas. The food on Air Force One is pretty good. I won't bury the lead. No, I think, first of all, people don't understand that we pay for everything. I mean, this is a pretty common area. Like, whether it's Air Force One or the charter plane with the president or the charter plane with Governor Romney, we pay a lot of money to fly.
Not personally.
Not personally. Our news organizations pay a lot of money to fly, and obviously reimburse them for all the expenses. That's the most important thing. It's a lot of fun. Look, we get paid to travel around the country and go to cities that we haven't been to before, and we get to do it, and we get paid to do it, and we get free meals, and we get to see fascinating places and hear the same fascinating speech thousands of times from the candidates. If you love history and politics, there's no better job. I've probably been at the 35 states in the last 5 years, all for free, all because of work. And the best part about it is the places that you visit and the people you meet. And that sounds cliched, I know, but if you're like me and you're just fascinated by this country or the world, there is no better opportunity. I flew with President Obama on his first foreign trip on Air Force One overseas, with him in London for the G8, Strasbourg, France for NATO, his first time in the Arab world when he went to Ankara, Turkey, and then Istanbul.
This is Politico, folks.
He gave a big speech about nuclear weapons in Prague. People, thousands of people in the square in Prague. Then this past summer, I flew with Governor Romney overseas on his foreign trip, which you all, I'm sure, remember. I was outside of number 10 Downing Street when he was standing there after meeting David Cameron and was facing some tough questions about his comments and, the president of Jerusalem. I'm sorry.
So
Anyways, it's a fascinating experience to get paid for. It's really neat. The challenge, though, and it's not all just sort of doing that. You actually have to produce something, right? I mean, so it can be really stressful. The combination of deadlines and technology, it doesn't always add up, and you find yourself oftentimes, racing into some Starbucks in some far-flung place, and holding onto your laptop and looking for Wi-Fi and trying to get your story in, and the editors are calling you and emailing you and say, "Where's the story?" So it's really neat, but it also is stressful too. Go ahead.
No, I'm just wondering. Do you think that the story gets reported right most of the time, or do you think that sometimes? I'm wondering what the interaction is between fellow reporters.
Yeah.
And whether a general mindset sets in, or does it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is some groupthink. There's no question about it. And that's nothing new to this campaign. I think that's sort of been part of campaigns going back for years and years and years. There is, when you're traveling overseas, traveling all over the country with a couple of dozen other reporters, a certain solidarity sets in, and you do tend to sort of start thinking the same way, which is a dangerous thing. I think we should try to break out of that, write our own sort of take on things. The biggest difference between covering politics now, what we do, and our predecessors in previous generations is that we sadly don't have the access to the candidates anymore. There was a time when if you were traveling with a candidate for president, you traveled with a candidate and his wife or his spouse. And you were on the plane talking to them, you'd have a dinner or a drink with them at the hotel that night. It was a pretty familiar sort of relationship. And obviously you'd write tough stories when the times called for that, but you knew the person and you could tell your readers or your viewers, this is what this person is like. Not just based upon some rally speech they gave or a press conference, but from talking to them, having a meal with them, traveling with them. I think voters are deprived of something now because we don't have that kind of relationship. Now, what the candidates and their handlers will say is, well, you guys don't have that access because you've abused it and because now you want to write about every damn thing behind the scenes and you don't want to respect their personal space.
Teddy White syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I think the olden days were not all perfect. I mean, the press looked the other way at a lot of ethical issues that nowadays are covered and should be covered. But I do think we've lost something, and the voter has lost something because we, as journalists, don't have the access to the principles anymore. And so oftentimes we're going based upon handlers, and the access that we do have is too often at a distance. Look, there are 2 weeks now left before the election. I doubt seriously that Romney or Obama will take questions from the press corps one time in the next 2 weeks. And that's just unacceptable.
And the same thing goes for television. I mean, we at Meet the Press, we're finally got an interview with Mitt Romney just 4 weeks ago, but he had not come on Meet the Press the entire campaign season. We still have not seen Paul Ryan do an interview with Meet the Press. He is going to join soon the ranks of the only two other Republican nominees for vice president never to do the show, Sarah Palin and Dan Quayle. Will not surprise you.
So illustrious pantheon.
Right. We have not had an interview with President Obama during this entire campaign cycle. When in 2008, when he was not the incumbent, he during the primary was on Meet the Press 6 or 7 times in 1 year. Yeah. So we have not had the opportunity to sit down with him for an extended period of time this entire campaign.
I'm wondering, are candidates and, well, not candidates so much, but also senators and other people difficult to deal with coming on Meet the Press sometimes? As in, do they sometimes have a lot of preconditions, or what is Meet the Press? They
don't really have preconditions because we never allow preconditions, but we do have what I like to call high maintenance issues.
Are you allowed to get into some of that?
There is no, requirement for green M&Ms or things like that, but people are very concerned, and the handlers about how long a person will have during an appearance. Sometimes you might be surprised to know this, but sometimes they only want a short interview. Okay, you can have the secretary of blah blah, but you only have them for 10 minutes. Or they want a longer period of time. Those sort of things are negotiable. Obviously, who they come on with. There are some senators who will only come on alone, will not sit next to a member of the opposite party and do a joint interview. Now, when I first started at Meet the Press, we would at least once or twice a month have the majority leader and minority leader of the U.S. Senate on the show together to talk about legislation and issues. I mean, Bob Dole and Mitchell, you were almost sick of seeing them together. There is not a chance in the last probably 8 years that we've had the majority and minority leader of the U.S. Senate on the show together. They will not appear with each other.
So the gridlock in Washington has even affected Meet the Press.
Oh yeah,
That's
definitely.
amazing to hear. I'm wondering about this sort of rise, and this is one of those new things for this cycle, and that's the rise of the fact checkers. So-called fact checkers, Washington Post, factcheck.org. I'm wondering if that is reassuring to the public to have these sort of, after an article is published or after an interview on Meet the Press, to have these bloggers or what, they don't like being called bloggers, obviously, but have these people come out and say, well, here's what's truthful and here's what's not. Is that reassuring to the public, or is that sort of second-guessing reporters at their job?
I love fact checking when you're actually checking facts. That's great, but some of the fact checkers and bloggers carry with them their own political perceptions, and as you all know, facts can sometimes be a little subjective. I mean, it's not black or white, some of these issues that we're talking about. They're very nuanced. You can find statistics to back almost anything up or down. So if there was an actual, unbiased, fact checker that you can trust, and there are some out there, and I find them very useful actually when doing preparation for the program, because we'll have a senator or somebody on and we can present them with some of the information that are in these fact check columns. But doing something like that real time on a program, it's next to impossible because everything these days is very nuanced.
I'm all for more accountability, and I'm all for more shared facts in a world where there's increasingly less of that, unfortunately. So I'm all for it. The challenge of fact checking is that people who pay attention to it are folks in this room, which is to say smart, engaged, sophisticated consumers of political news. I think the vast majority of Americans don't care about fact checking because they aren't following it that closely, right? I mean, but I think for high information voters and certainly for the political class, I think it's a good thing.
Okay. I'm wondering what you would do if you could do something. What would you like to see more out of the media is what I'm trying to say.
More out of the media.
Yeah, and what are you unable to do? To the kinds of stories that you wish you could do and are unable to do. Is that
That's easy. Yeah, absolutely. Have more access to principals. Talk to candidates. Talk to their families. Get a sense for who they are, what drives them, what they really believe in, what they want to do, what made them. That's the service that we provide the public, is telling a story about who these people are that want to lead the country. Mm-hmm. And when we have to go through 17 layers of 28-year-old kids telling us which way is up and down, it ain't easy. So that's what I prefer to have. Now, our friends that work in politics say, look, you guys are never going to be happy until you're in the room when we're making decisions and you guys are there with a tape recorder and you can hear everything. Well, then there's some truth to that, but that's how it should be. The press should never be happy. The press should never be content. It should always be pushing for more access. But I think most folks in politics would agree that we have gotten to a point now where the pendulum has swung too far and that we just don't have enough access to these folks because they figured out a way that they can reach the public without going through a filter. Not entirely, and they still will have to talk to the media, but technology has changed in a way now where the candidates and the politicians can reach voters more easily, and that they don't always have to go through us.
And money,
and
I
that's
think, is a
frustration.
factor too that's changed. I mean, with all the money in campaigns, the campaigns they're more than happy to spend millions of dollars on television ads. And speaking of fact checking, they can say whatever they want in a television ad. There is no fact checkers on that. There is no Federal Trade Commission of political campaign advertising. You can say whatever you want, and
certain news companies do have like the standards, right? They'll cut off.
Right, you can't say someone killed their wife,
Right.
but I mean you can go a
they
very
did.
long way.
Yes, they did, yeah.
On a political, I mean, I just read today that, was it the Obama campaign was thinking about doing Romney campaign,
It's not going to happen now, I don't think.
a 30-minute
Infomercial.
infomercial that they were going to place on the air in swing states. Of course they are. It's no one's. I mean, they can say whatever they want and not be challenged and get away with it.
Right.
So I'm guessing you're not feeling great about the 2012 campaign in general. It seems because you're not getting the vice president. What was one of the better campaigns? I mean, if you could look at a model for a year.
I would say 2000 or 92. You know, 92 was the first campaign I covered, so that was to me, and maybe just because I was, you know, a 21-year-old, but I thought that was a great campaign. A lot of characters. I mean, Bill Clinton. What else can you ask for?
That's great.
I think the last campaign was fun. I just, for the similar reasons. I mean, the personalities all in one campaign was extraordinary, and it defied Hollywood, as we know. So I think it's going to be hard to match what happened in 2008. And I think, in fairness to this campaign, which is almost now finished, we can look at it in the rearview mirror with more perspective. You know, it suffered by comparison to the last campaign, right? I mean, this campaign was like the equivalent of, you know, following Frank Sinatra in his prime, right? It's just not fair to the band because what happened before it is so damn good. So, look, this campaign's been frustrating for the reasons that we've mentioned, but it was the last time was just so extraordinary. It's sort of hard to match.
Okay, great. I think we're going to open up to some questions.
Yeah, let's
now.
get some questions. And by the way, before we take questions, I want to recognize Jack, who is a proud graduate of this school and is one of the finest Washington College graduates, and is a fantastic writer.
One
and
of the best
historian.
Washington College grads you know, I think.
Exactly.
I did actually want to recognize one other person with us tonight who 50 years ago this month was campaigning all across Indiana, and that's Senator Birchbach.
Betsy,
Yeah.
The reason I just can't stand so often watching, it's not just Meet the Press, but programs like it, is I just get so sick and tired of having these interviewees spouting off the party line.
Right. The talking
And
point.
how do you
Amen, brother.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you
Believe me,
separate
it's
the
frustrating. It's very frustrating. I mean, what we try to do is, you know, structure the questions so that you're not asking a question that you can just get a talking point back. And if you do, you know, thinking of the appropriate follow-ups to that. But I mean, you play producer for a second. What do you do about that? You want to be able to hear from these people and question them. But if they stick, I mean, listen to the debates too. I mean, how many questions were actually answered in the debates? I mean, they answer whatever they want to answer.
Right.
Dr. Reese?
Thanks very much, both of you, coming to Washington College.
Good to be here.
You said some critical things about the candidates in the campaign. I'm wondering if you could offer some criticisms of the media.
Of course. Plenty.
If you don't have any, I could volunteer.
Yeah. Plenty to go around. And I think, to be fair, our criticism of the campaigns and the candidates was a sort of a sweeping indictment, if you will. And it's less about any one candidate or campaign and more the way that we live now as a political press corps. And, you know, I was actually having this conversation with one of the top advisors to the Romney campaign over the weekend. And I said, look, it's partially your fault, but it's partially our fault too. I mean, you know, we're the ones, not just this cycle, but in the cycles leading up to this, we tolerate the lack of access. We tolerate the fact that we don't get to see the candidates up close, and we don't get to ask the questions. I mean, we should be in a full revolt, I think. There is no question that the press corps too often engages in groupthink. We mentioned this earlier. When you're on a plane for weeks and months at a time, you tend to sort of write and think alike. I think that's a challenge. I do think that the press corps does get too focused on, and this is cliched, but does get too focused on the sort of horse race of the moment and speculation about who's up and who's down, and perhaps does not do enough about covering issues at great depth. But on that, I think, you know, part of the challenge there is that people say, we want more about issues, more about issues. People don't vote on just issues. People also vote about who these candidates are and how they feel about the candidates as people, as you know, fathers and husbands, wives and mothers. So I do worry about that in the sense that, yeah, there should be, you know, robust coverage of policy and issues, but we shouldn't pretend that most voters are going to the ballot booth on election day and say, okay, so where's this candidate on Medicaid reform, and let's see, where are they about aid to the Contras, or I mean, it's people vote on more than just policy. So I think we have to be careful about that critique. Look, I think that the press also relies upon access, and so at times we can be a little bit hesitant of biting the hand that feeds us because we want to have access to sources and to principles. And so, do you sometimes write things as tough as they should be written, given, you're going to have to do business with that person for the next day, week, and month. So, do you have some critiques?
Sure. I also think there can sometimes be a tendency in the press to go after what we call the shiny object.
Yes.
And, at the expense of focusing on some other important issues, whatever sort of the, interesting cable topic of the week is,
Right.
that everyone focuses, an extraordinary amount of attention on something that probably isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. And so I think we can sometimes be guilty of that.
Betsy, how do you pick the leading question on Meet the Press usually?
You mean picking
The question that opens the interview, because that is usually seen as one of the more important questions on the show.
Right, and we're also trying to think of beyond sort of what the first question is. We sort of approach the interview from the other end backwards. What are we hoping to elicit from the guest? What sort of news is, what sort of issue has he not commented on? Or where does there seem to be a conflict in a position that this person has now versus 4 years ago? And how do we, where are the areas that make the guest feel uncomfortable? I mean, our job is, I think, to really kind of learn as much as we can about the guest and take the other side and play devil's advocate in these sort of interviews, and do that equally with Republicans and with Democrats. So that's what we're sort of thinking about when we're putting together the interview, is what we want to get out of it, and then structure the questions accordingly, if that makes any sense.
Fletcher?
Following the leadership of our president, I don't mean Obama, I mean Reese. Let me bore in a little bit more here. There seems to be a substantial angst among the body politic about the entire press, the entire media. What, in your opinion, is causing that, and how do you feel about it?
So the question is, what is causing the sort of anger towards the media?
You tell me.
Sure. I think people who are passionate about politics are typically passionate about politics for reasons that are very different from why we're passionate about politics, because they feel strongly about one side or the other. And so if they see the press corps acting in a way that they feel isn't being sufficiently tough about the side that they're against, they oftentimes get angry. I mean, the lion's share of email and phone calls that I get that are angry are partisan right or left, saying you were too easy on X or you were too tough on Y. I mean, that's usually what it is. I mean, that's
when I go through viewer email every week, there's usually half the emails that's positive, great job, appreciate the interview, and then of course the other half are negative. Right. And of the negative, it's split half and half. David Gregory, you're a right-wing crazy nut, and then on the other side, you left-wing. And it's the same exact interview that people have seen, and their own political perceptions dictate how they feel negatively toward the questions or the interviews. So I do think there is some sort of, and I think we've seen this more over the last probably 4 years, that there's this tendency, and maybe this is the, can be attributed to the Foxes and the MSNBCs of the world, that people like to hear their own political views spouted back to them. That's what they seem to want to hear. And that's why I think you see, both of those cable networks, getting large ratings and viewers, because people, I don't think there's this, unfortunately for us anyway, a thirst as much for people to hear both sides of an issue.
They want to have their views reinforced.
Back there, a question from a student.
You talked earlier about how polling seems to be a little bit more stubborn in places like Ohio in general across the country. But news today goes so quickly by. I was wondering why polls don't seem to react as much to a lot of the quick information. Or do you think they do?
They do. I mean,
The question is, are the polls moving as quickly as the information that's coming in? Why?
I mean, it's harder to cover the race because it does move so fast, but that's been what's so fascinating about Ohio is that the news of Governor Romney's performance in Denver spread pretty damn fast, and I think the polling really was favorable for him, both nationally and a lot of key states in the days after. And the fact that Ohio didn't really move that quickly, and I think it's starting to now. You're seeing some signs that Governor Romney's closing in Ohio, but the fact that it was still pretty stubborn was an indicator to a lot of us that Governor Romney still has a challenge there. That's still a tough state for him because while all these other states were moving, Ohio was either not moving or moving slower.
We also have a lot of polls these days, too,
Yeah.
which is
It's a challenge to wade through all those. Yeah,
Some
David
are
Plouffe.
more reputable than others.
David Plouffe last night said to me, "This is Obama's, senior advisor." He said, "Next thing you know, we're going to have the Outback Steakhouse poll." I mean, it's just every outfit out under the sun is now publishing
Margarine
a
of
poll.
error. Yes.
Yeah, margarine of error, exactly. Get it.
Sorry, right there.
Yes, sir. How is your viewership holding up on Meet the Press, considering all of these amazing vehicles for delivery of news and interviews and so forth?
The
Well,
question is, how's the viewership holding up for?
I think over the last couple of years, all the Sunday programs, their numbers are diminishing because there are so many other outlets out there, unfortunately, for people to see a lot of these newsmaker guests. I mean, so many cable outlets, you just flip the channels now and you can see Senator X or Senator Y a million times during the week. And so what makes an interview on Sunday special? Well, that's our job to try to make it special. But I think people are engaged more throughout the week that maybe on Sunday they don't want to sit down and watch for an hour. But I think there's just so much of it out there. And so that's our challenge is, to try to make ours, hour well spent and worth it.
Greg?
So regarding this concern about the principals not answering questions asked, regurgitating the topic.
Right.
Is there a fear amongst most of the press that if you press them, that you won't be asked to ask a question again tomorrow?
Is there a fear that if you ask a question as among the press, will you not be able to ask it again or ask a question again?
The fear of retribution. I think if you ask a question that is out of bounds, then I think that's possible. But I think if you ask a fair question, then you're going to have a chance to, ask more questions. Yeah, I mean the idea that these campaigns are mafioso types. You've made the wrong decision here. You're out of business in this house. I mean, it's not quite like that. I mean, when President Obama was first in office, he came into the press room in his first week, and the press room, just so you know, is typically seen as, even though it's in the White House, sort of our area, and we paid to be there. And when the president comes there, it's to do business. And when he was walking through the press area, I asked him a question about the fact that he had a ban on lobbyists in his administration, but had given a waiver to his number two at the Pentagon, who had been a top lobbyist for one of the defense contractors. And I said, how do you reconcile that with this ban on lobbyists? And of course, he and his staff weren't terribly fond of that question, as you can imagine. I have had since then a fine relationship with them, and I mean, so.
That exchange made the evening news of President Obama saying something like, if you gotta, jump on me every time I come down here, I'm not gonna
Get
come
out of
down.
here, kid.
Exactly right. And Jonathan was the one guy doing it.
Yeah, we have had some one-hit wonders on Meet the Press for that reason, but
Here we go. This is better.
may not have come back. But usually, I think sometimes there have been, the rip off the microphone, not during the interview, thank God, but, kind of marching off the set on occasion under some tough, but I think fair questioning.
But folks want to be on the show
But
now.
there does come a time,
Right.
it does come back around that, there is an upside for being on. And, usually, we can work on repairing a relationship and getting the person back on the program. But there have been.
I mean, it's a give and take because, they can be upset about us till the cows come home, but ultimately they still want the attention and want to be able to have the profile that being in the paper on TV affords.
Tyler, I'm sorry. Yes.
Back in 2000, I worked actually in the primary for Voter News Service, the late
Yeah.
news service, because I gather a consortium.
Right.
of
Exit polls.
wire service, free exit polls.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting to see what went on at the precinct level.
Yeah.
There was actually a lot of it was hard to do it right and hard to know. But given what happened in 2000 with exit polling, what, if anything, has taken its place, or is every network or whatever blog out there doing its own, or are they just staying away from that?
The
That's a good
question is,
question.
what is exit polling like in 2012?
We do have, the networks and the wires have gotten together and created their own pool for exit polls. So it's the same thing, just under a different banner. But a lot of safeguards and review process went into that exit poll structure after 2000, and also how we utilize the exit poll. And we're very careful not to overdraw conclusions from what we're seeing on the poll. Things are very weighted election night when results are coming in, to provide for whether the polling in one precinct or one area is overly weighted and can skew the results. We're also very, very, very protective of the data. It used to be sort of when that exit poll would come in at 5, everybody would be on the phone to their other reporter friends, and the word would spread, and Drudge would post it. And there's a lot of, it's kept very slowly, very, very tight hold. And then we cannot really we can't report it all in the exit polls until the polls are closed, but we can't really even draw that many conclusions. To me, the exit polls are really just helpful the day after when you're trying to analyze data and why an election was important and different demographics who voted for other people. I mean, that's how mostly we use the exit poll, not so much as calling races anymore, but just to study the electoral history afterward. Yeah.
Sir? Yeah.
And also, there's so much early voting these days too that also I think
It's harder,
it
yeah.
probably will be even more difficult this year.
Do you see the Twitter world making more increasingly relevant, where a political candidate can have 2 to 3 million followers, and not have to go through your political or meet the press?
Yeah.
The question is, do candidates have to go through the reporters anymore, or can they just get on Twitter and talk to
And
their
this is
followers?
sort of the age-old question: is candidates and their handlers trying to find ways around the press, right? I mean, they've been looking for that for centuries now, right? Take their message straight to the people and go around those damn reporters
Andrew Jackson.
with their annoying questions in that First Amendment. So, look, this is the latest iteration of it, and that's technology, and the fact that they can go on Twitter and they can go straight to people. Yeah, so that's one way that they can go around us, but people still get their news overwhelmingly from TV, newspapers, or online news organizations, or newspapers that are online, radio. There's no question people are migrating online, but they still go to news outlets to figure out what's happening in the world. And I think that is still, the reality of where we're at. So campaigns are going to find all kinds of tools to try and go around this, but I think as long as people still get their information from news outlets, I think that we're going to have a critical role.
How are we on time right now?
I think 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, great. You, sir?
We just heard 4 debates in which the press was represented by the moderator. How would you score the moderators, and what lessons do you think you learned?
I'll get to Betsy.
So how would you score the moderators of the debates?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on what you consider the definition or the role of the moderator to be. And it is just not set up to be an extended interview. It's really set up by the commission, good or bad, you can decide, that the moderator is really there to facilitate a back and forth, not to ask probing questions or to do the sort of follow-ups that you would do in sort of a one-on-one or a television sort of interview. And that's the way that, the commission sets it up, that's the way that they want to do it, and I mean, you all can be the judge of whether that's useful or not.
Didn't the campaigns come to an understanding on Candy Crowley saying they didn't want her coaching
Yeah, well,
Well, that was the town hall.
that was
Right.
the town hall. And in 2008, Tom Brokaw was the moderator for the town hall debate. And I produced that debate with him and worked with him on selecting those questions that the town hall participants came up with. And there was a lot of, how to put this nicely, a little bit of pushback with the commission on exactly what Tom's role was going to be in that debate. And Tom, being the outstanding journalist that he is, felt very strongly about not just simply being the traffic cop in a debate and calling on, Joe or Sue in the audience, that his role as a journalist was to be able to ask follow-up questions and try to hold the candidates as accountable as he could. And that was not the role that the debate commission wanted him to do. Ultimately, we ended up doing it, but there was not a lot of happy debate commission people afterwards.
One more question?
So, Dr. Taylor, I think you had a question?
I have a question about Meet the Press. You spoke earlier about the competition to get the guests that you want onto the show. How often do people see the media outlet lobby you to get on the show, and how often are they successful?
How often do people lobby Meet the Press, and how often are they successful to get on the show?
Call that a pitch in TV world, and we do get our share of pitches. Usually it's not so much from newsmakers, although there are certain people that are more available than maybe you would necessarily need them to be at all times.
Don't call us, we'll call you.
We'll keep that in mind. We have certain things that we'll say. A lot of times it's the actual pitches that will come through are more about people that have books, authors that are also newsmakers, because it's more of a structured process. If you're publishing a book, there's a very set sort of media plan to release that book and do interviews. So a publisher, a publicist will call us and say, are you interested? And a lot of times it's the other way around. We see that somebody's publishing a book, and we call their offices and say, we'd like the first interview with, Colin Powell on his book tour. So it's a little bit of both. The campaigns we deal with very frequently, and they will, it's a continuing conversation and also a continuing conversation with the White House. The White House has a communications shop set up and a specific person detailed to kind of guest booking on various television programs. So I talk to this person more than I would ever want to talk to this person. He's a nice guy. I've been dealing with him for a long time now. And so there's a continuing dialogue with the White House or with the campaigns on who might be available on a particular Sunday on a particular topic. Sometimes it's the White House or the campaign saying, hey, we'd like to offer you an interview with Jeb Bush, just throwing out a name. He's our big surrogate. We want to get him out there this weekend. Are you interested? Yes, I am interested. Other weeks it would be calling and saying, we'd really love to have Jeb Bush this weekend. Can you make it work? And then the Romney campaign would call over to Jeb Bush and say, hey, we'd really like you to go out on our behalf this weekend and represent the campaign on Meet the Press. So it just depends on the week, what's going on, but it's a dialogue that we have back and forth with the campaigns and with the White House every week.
So, Dr. Taylor, you can address your pitches to Betsy. Okay, thank you so much for coming to the Anatomy for Elections series.